everyone, my name is Mary Margaret if you're new here, and if you are a returning subscriber, welcome back. Today is an installment of Friday Reads, and since it is just now February, I decided to go ahead and give you guys a January wrap-up and tell you my thoughts on what I finished reading in the month of January. Now in January, I actually had quite a good reading month, and that's because half of the month I was off school and work. And then the second half of the month I didn't get to read nearly as much, but that's okay because I actually was able to finish reading 8 books in the month of January, which I was very pleased with. And I'm just gonna go ahead and get started talking about what I read. The first thing I finished reading in January was Edna St. Vincent Millay's collected poems. If you have watched some of my other videos, you will know that I actually started reading this back in, I think, April of last year. And it was actually my second attempt to read the collection of poetry anyway. I had started reading it 2 or 3, I think it's 2 years ago. I had started reading it and then I had to return it to the library. So I started at the very beginning back in April for the second time, and I finally finished it in January of this year. Now, this collection of poetry is like this big. I did take quite a long time to read this, and I think the reason for that is because a lot of these poems were very, very dark. They actually kind of reminded me a bit of what I've read of Christina Rossetti's poems. Very gothic, and a lot of references to death in general, but also just a lot of really kind of creepy things from maybe medieval and Renaissance literature that I'm not as well aware of. But that being said, I did find a lot of poems that I loved in it, but it's not my new favorite book of poetry, which I had originally thought it was going to be, because the first quarter of the book or so I found the poems to be just wonderful, but over time I found it to become a little bit too one note in some ways for my taste, and I say that just because the perspectives again were just so dark, and believe me, I like plenty of depressing and dark literature. It's not because it was dark that I didn't like it. I just felt like it didn't have enough dimension or depth to it for me personally. And I do think a large part of that is probably just because I didn't understand a lot of it. So I think I would like to go back and read it again at some point, but at this juncture I'm just kind of happy I finished reading it. I ended up not rating it on Goodreads at the point when I finished it, but I would say I'd probably give it about 3.5 stars. There were quite a few poems that I would give 5 stars, but overall, just the collection in general, I think it was the fact that there were just so many poems that it just got a little bit overwhelming for me. So I did enjoy it, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's my new favorite. That's kind of how I would summarize it. And again, it's not that I don't like Edna St. Vincent Millay. I think she was super talented. I really enjoyed reading her poems. It's just that they aren't my new favorite or anything like that. So that's the first book I finished in January. The second book was another book that I started last year that I kind of put on the back burner and am just now happy to report that I finished, and that is Ernest Hemingway's A Movable Feast. Now, this is a collection of writings that Hemingway wrote mostly during the 1920s in Paris, but also there are some writings from Switzerland and other places around Europe. Now, I personally found this to be very enjoyable. You get to encounter a lot of really important people in the arts and in literature from that time period. He talks about Gertrude Stein, he talks about F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald, and he also talks about a lot of just different poets and artists from that time period. Now, I will say though, a lot of them are people I don't care for as much, such as Ezra Pound, who is a horrible man. I didn't really care too much about James Joyce, and just people like that he talked about quite frequently. I found that to be a little bit repetitive because he just kept talking about how amazing Ezra Pound was. Granted, this was before World War II when Ezra Pound really showed how he was, but that being said, I just didn't really care for that. And then of course Hemingway has some misogynist statements that he makes in A Movable Feast, and some of the things he said about Gertrude Stein I found to be just unnecessary. And then also he was an incredibly judgmental person. Passed himself off as this person who wasn't a judgmental person, but he was also being judgmental. But all that being said, I did really enjoy reading it. I found there were so many quotable parts to it, and it really did transport me out of where I was at the time, which I started it in April last year again. And so it was really nice to kind of meander my way through Paris during the 1920s, by reading the book, and I think overall I had a positive experience with it. I gave it, I think, 4 or 4.5 stars, somewhere around there, and I found it to just be an enjoyable read. As someone who's interested in France and the 1920s and art and literature, I found the behind-the-scenes perspective to be really interesting. The version that I read actually had additional excerpts that had been cut from the final publication in its original form. I found that to be really interesting, and I would recommend, if you are interested in the 1920s, Ernest Hemingway, anything to do with art or literature during that time period. But I am hoping to read more Hemingway this year as well. I think I'll probably read To Have and Have Not, because that's one of my favorite Humphrey Bogart movies with Lauren Bacall, and I know that the script for that was co-written by William Faulkner, and so I want to read the book by Hemingway and then go watch the movie again, because I think that would be super fun. The next book I read in January was The Three Musketeers. Now, I could do an entire video about that book. I genuinely disliked it so much that I'm amazed I even finished it. I listened to it on audiobook and I made a lot of progress on one of my samplers that I'm sewing, so that was a positive from that experience, but I did not enjoy it. I read it to complete the book and join in the conversation for the Past It Classics book club that I've mentioned before in my videos. I'll link all the information down below about that. And yes, everything that they said is what I would say about that. So if you're curious about my opinion on it, you can go watch their video, which again, I'll link below. I personally just found it to be really not the most interesting story, and I didn't really care for any of the characters. I tried so hard to grasp onto someone and to enjoy their character, and I just got disappointed time and again. I don't really understand why the Three Musketeers are held up as this paragon of friendship in literature, and I was just disappointed. And I remember as a kid watching the Wishbone TV series and thinking that the Three Musketeers sounded so fun, and I was very disappointed. So I gave it 2 stars, and I felt like that was kind of generous considering my opinion of it. I just found it very underwhelming, and I would not recommend it to anyone. I know it's a classic of literature, and my opinion is definitely in the minority. If you look on Goodreads, the average rating is above 4 stars. It's just, you know, that's okay. We all have different opinions, but yes, would not recommend The Three Musketeers. The next book that I read was a super short collection of poetry by an Instagram poet named Mark Anthony, I think. I don't know if it's Mark Anthony or Mark Antony. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's called The Beautiful Truth, and I read that in like 30 to 40 minutes. Like I said, very short, and I thought it was enjoyable, but definitely not my favorite of the collections that I've read of Mark Anthony. I found it to be pretty good, but not groundbreaking, so, you know. But it was a very short read and I enjoyed it, and I do follow his work on Instagram, so that's where I found that one originally. The next book I finished was one that I started again last year. I am trying really hard right now to finish books that I started last year that I kind of just forgot about, and that book was, where is it? I had to go get it off my shelf, so I think I moved. And the next book that I read was The Waves by Virginia Woolf. This was an interesting excursion for me. I have read one other book by Virginia Woolf, and that is kind of the standard that most people have read by her, which is Mrs. Dalloway. I really enjoyed that one, and I found it to be a really interesting read, and I really liked the writing style. However, this one was not my favorite of the two. I think it was really groundbreaking in the sense that the writing is very innovative for the time period, and I liked the ideas behind it. But I personally didn't care as much about the characters in this as I did in Mrs. Dalloway, and I don't know. It was not my favorite. I think it was worth a read, and I do see myself revisiting it in the future, and I do think I might enjoy it more the second time around, but yeah. I don't know, it just didn't work for me as well, which is surprising because Mrs. Dalloway takes place in the city mostly, so it's definitely much more of a metropolitan kind of setting. This is much more a mix, but there's definitely a heavy emphasis on nature, hence The Waves being the title, and it has to do with the waves of life and how things come, things go, that sort of thing. So I get that, I get the metaphor, but I didn't find it to be as impactful as Mrs. Dalloway. But like I said, I want to keep this in my collection and reread it and see what I think of it in the future. And I think that sort of spreading it out for as long of a time period as I did for reading it was probably not my best idea. So I want to read it again and kind of compact my reading experience more and see what I think. But I'm hoping to read more Virginia Woolf this year, either To the Lighthouse or A Room of One's Own, if not both. So we'll see. If you have a recommendation, definitely let me know. So I'm definitely not quitting on Virginia Woolf. I find her writing to be really interesting. So it's not like I'm gonna just stop reading her work. I think it's one of those things you have to get accustomed to her writing. And I think that I've been away from it for such a long time because I read Mrs. Dalloway like 3 years ago that I need to kind of re-immerse myself. But yeah, I gave this 3.5 stars, I think, was what I gave it. I'll link my Goodreads below so you can read my review and see what you think. My main takeaway from this is that I got tired of the word now after reading this because there were so many sentences where she started the sentence with, now I'm doing this, now this happens, now Bernard is doing this, now Ginny's doing that, now the waves come in, now the waves go out. And I just got to the point where I was like, okay, I get it. It's happening now. Can you stop saying now? Now. That'd be great. So, but that was partially just me being really picky and annoyed. So there's that. But I know a lot of people absolutely adore this. Again, I think I'm in the minority for thinking this was not as good to me. So just take my opinion with a grain of salt. The next book that I finished in January was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. I talked about this in a previous video, actually I think maybe even 2 videos previously, because I buddy read this with Julia from Shakespeare and such, and I really did like this book, but I don't love it. I found it to be really a time capsule in a lot of ways because it really captured the essence of Brooklyn during the time period in which this is set. I think it's from 1910 to 1918. Somewhere around there, because this is definitely a generational story where it talks about Francie, but it also talks about her parents and her aunts and uncles and things like that. So I did really like this, and as I said in a previous video, Francie is one of my new favorite literary characters, but I wouldn't say it's one of my new favorite books. However, that being said, I am going to keep this in my collection because there were so many wonderful things that were written. I think Betty Smith had a lot of really awesome ideas about education in here, which I loved as a teacher. I really liked a lot of the different descriptions because it felt like I was actually in Brooklyn during this time period. And I think she did a really excellent job of capturing how children think as well, which was really interesting. And I think it's a really good look at this time period. But my main problem with it is I felt like it was overly tragic. There were a lot of different things in it that I feel like didn't necessarily need to be in the story to make the story as compelling as it was anyway. There were some really traumatic experiences in Francie's life that are just kind of breezed over, and I did not really appreciate that. And then of course, because this is older, there are also some really outdated and very offensive things that are written in here, whether it's statements or opinions or whatever it may be. That was very problematic, but I do try to take into account the time period in which it was written, but I don't excuse what is included in it, if that makes sense, just because it's like that sort of thing is not excusable at any point in history. So I did really like this. I think it's one of those stories that's going to stay with me, and the characters are going to stay with me forever. It had a very deep impression on me in that respect, and I had a wonderful time buddy reading this with Julia. We had the best conversation, so thanks for joining me on that, Julia, and I'm so glad I finally read this. I think I gave this 3.5, 4 stars. I can't even remember my ratings because the books that I finished this month, I just couldn't, I don't know. Sometimes you just know the rating you're gonna give something, and then other times you're like, I don't know. I think this way is how I feel, but then it sort of changes over time. So I don't really know for sure what I would rate this, but I think 3.5 to 4 stars is what I would say. A very good book, but definitely not one of my new favorites. The next book I finished in January is actually not necessarily a book, it's a play, and that is Hamlet by William Shakespeare, of course. I mentioned this in a previous video, my recent Friday reads from last week, and that was a play that I started last year, again, trying to finish things from last year that I kind of put to the side. and I'm really glad I read it. It has so many different parts in it that everyone has heard at one time or another, and I really enjoyed reading it for that reason. I think it's a fascinating story, but I will say the ending was a bit anticlimactic for me, probably because I forgot that, well, I don't want to say because I don't want to spoil it, but I don't know. I want to watch the movie that was made with Laurence Olivier because I love him and I think he would be an excellent Hamlet. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it's my favorite Shakespeare I've read so far, but I'm excited to continue with my Shakespeare journey. I thought it was, of course, well written. Again, who's not going to agree that Shakespeare wrote very well? And I think it's a very exciting thing I finally finished it, but I don't really have a rating for it just because it's really hard to rate Shakespeare. I have a really difficult time rating something like that. So again, no real clear rating for that, but I'm really glad I finished that. And the very last book that I finished in January was the book Wonderstruck, and that's by Brian Selznick, who wrote The Invention of Hugo Cabret. I have mentioned that is one of my favorite children's books. I think it's just lovely, and I love Brian Selznick's illustrations. And I feel bad because a lot of the books I've mentioned in this month that I finished reading were not necessarily bad, but not my favorite, if that makes sense. And that's how I feel about Wonderstruck. I think it had some really awesome subjects that it covered. I think it did a wonderful job of telling a really intricate story, but I found the plot to be quite predictable. And I didn't really feel like the characters were very well developed. And I don't know, I feel like it just felt like it didn't quite impact me the same way that Hugo did, which is disappointing because I feel like it had so much potential, but I just found it very underwhelming. And by the time I reached the end, I was like, that's it? That's the ending? Okay. I really enjoyed the plot between the young girl who is introduced at the beginning of the book and the young boy who is introduced in the beginning of the book, and how those two storylines came together. And I thought those characters, in particular the young girl, I really enjoyed reading about her, or seeing, I should say. Her storyline is told through illustrations, but it's not my new favorite book, I will say. Anyway, that is all that I read in January. I apologize if I seem negative in this video. I'm trying to be as honest as I can about what I thought about what I read this month. I think that I had some really good reads, some sort of meh reads, and I'm excited to see what happens in February. So far, I've had some really interesting reads going on, and I look forward to telling you about what I'm currently reading and what I plan to read next in my next Friday reads, which will be, of course, next Friday. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will talk to you very soon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!